It was one of those evenings when the world felt softer, like everything had been dipped in honey and wrapped in golden light. I'd just returned from the market, the paper bags rustling against my legs as I pushed the front door open with my shoulder. The familiar scent of fresh coffee greeted me, still warm in the pot from the morning. I took a deep breath, letting the smell comfort me, ground me. It was always the little routines that made the day feel stable, predictable. I set the bags down on the kitchen island, my hands aching from carrying them too far. That's when I saw it. An envelope, stark white against the dark granite countertop. It looked almost out of place, like it didn't belong in our kitchen. My name was on it, bold and deliberate, in a handwriting I recognized too well. My pulse quickened, and a shiver crawled up my spine. I wanted to ignore it, to go on unpacking groceries, but something in me knew that this envelope was a wound just waiting to be opened. I slipped my finger under the seal, tearing it slowly, as if that could somehow delay whatever truth lay inside. Divorce papers. The words blurred as I scanned the pages, my hands trembling. Accusations of infidelity, of reckless spending, of being emotionally unstable. I couldn't breathe. My legs gave out, and I leaned against the counter, gripping the edge so hard my knuckles turned white. How could this be real? I went over every word again, hoping I'd misread, that I'd somehow gotten it wrong. But no. My husband's name was right there, signed at the bottom of each page, neat and precise. He'd planned this, thought about it, drafted it, signed it, all without giving me the slightest hint. I dropped the papers onto the counter, their crisp edges fluttering in the sudden gust from the open window. My mind raced with fragmented memories, his late nights at the office, the way he'd stopped reaching for my hand in the car, the way he looked at me like I was an inconvenience. It all fell into place, like puzzle pieces I'd been trying to force together the wrong way. A door creaked open, and I turned to see him walking in, a tired smile on his face, the same one he always wore when coming back from work. He didn't even glance at the papers as he kissed me on the cheek, his lips brushing mine like he couldn't be bothered to linger. "Hey, babe," he murmured, setting his briefcase down. "How was your day?" I didn't respond, couldn't. My mouth was dry, and I could feel my heart thundering in my chest. He finally noticed the papers, his face shifting from casual to something colder, more calculated. He leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms like he'd just remembered a minor errand he'd forgotten to complete. "You weren't supposed to see those yet," he said, almost with a hint of regret. "But maybe it's better this way. I hope you understand." Understand? Understand what? That he'd spent years weaving his dreams into mine only to tear them apart without warning? That he'd decided, all on his own, to rip our life in half and leave me to deal with the pieces? I couldn't find the words. My voice felt trapped, stuck somewhere between my throat and my heart. I watched him move through the room, unaffected, like this wasn't the moment my entire world crumbled. He poured himself a cup of coffee, black and bitter, like he always did, and sipped it without a second glance at me. I wanted to scream, to throw the cup against the wall, to make him see the chaos he'd just unleashed. But I stayed frozen, my hands still clutching the counter, my body betraying me by refusing to move or react. He glanced over his shoulder, meeting my eyes just briefly. "It's not personal," he said. "I just need to focus on my career now. You've been great, but it's time." My heart sank. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was how casual he was about it. As if I'd just been an accessory to his ambition. Something useful, until I wasn't. When he left the room, I was still there, staring at the papers, at the signature that might as well have been a knife to my chest. And that's when I knew. I wasn't just losing him, I was losing myself too. 6 years ago, the world felt limitless, I remember it clearly. The glimmer of soft light flickering off crystal wine glasses. The low hum of conversation blending with soft jazz in the background. That night, I was at a local charity event, an evening I almost didn't attend. But I did, and that's where I met him. He stood near the bar, laughing at something the bartender said, his eyes bright with ambition. He wore confidence like it was stitched into his very skin. Crisp suit, polished shoes, and a smile that promised possibility. He approached me with the ease of someone who always knew the right things to say. "You don't look like you belong." "Here," he'd joked, offering me a glass of champagne. I'd laughed, my cheeks flushing at the attention. "And what does someone who belongs here look like?" I'd asked. He shrugged, his eyes never leaving mine. Not half as interesting. That was how it started. A smile, a joke, a glass of champagne that would later turn into dinners, late-night phone calls, and whispered dreams. He spoke of his aspirations, starting his own company, building something from the ground up. His voice would take on a different quality when he talked about it, like he could already see it in his mind. And I believed him. I believed in him with everything I had. When we moved in together, it was my savings that paid the deposit. My salary covered the rent, the groceries, the electric bill. He said it was temporary, just until his business took off. I didn't mind. I was proud of him, proud to be part of something bigger than myself. Friends would ask why I worked 2 jobs, why I'd quit night classes to pick up extra shifts. They whispered concerns, their voices laced with caution. "He's using you," they'd say. But I didn't listen. How could I? Love had a way of making sacrifices feel like investments. Our life together seemed picture perfect from the outside. We hosted dinner parties in our tiny apartment, decorating the table with mismatched plates and flickering candles. He would hold my hand under the table, squeezing it just before making a toast to our future. My heart would swell with pride each time. We were a team. Or so I thought. But there were signs. Small, insidious things that wormed their way into my subconscious like seeds of doubt. Late-night business meetings that stretched until dawn, missed calls, unexplained absences. His phone, once casually left on countertops and coffee tables, became an extension of his hand. He guarded it fiercely, setting it face down, keeping it locked with a password I didn't know. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was the price of ambition. I trusted him. I had to. I remember one evening, specifically. We were at a networking event, the kind of glitzy affair he loved. I wore a pale blue dress, the one he'd bought me for my birthday. He was in his element, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and laughing at jokes that weren't funny. I stood by the bar, nursing a glass of wine, watching him with a mixture of pride and longing. He looked back at me, catching my eye, and I swear for just a second, I saw something slip. A flicker of impatience, like I was an accessory that didn't quite match his ensemble. The moment passed, his smile returned, and he made his way back to me, pressing a kiss to my cheek. "You look beautiful," he'd whispered, his fingers brushing my hair back. I'd smiled, the warmth of his touch chasing away the doubt that had briefly lingered. "I couldn't do any of this without you," he added, his voice so sincere I almost cried. I believed him. God, I wanted to believe him. But that night, as I lay beside him in bed, his back turned to me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was grasping at smoke, trying to hold on to something that wasn't really there. His breathing was steady, peaceful. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks that stretched like spider webs above me. They reminded me of us, fragile, holding on by threads. But still, I didn't want to let go. 3 weeks ago, he kissed my forehead as I poured his morning coffee. His hands lingered on my shoulders, his lips brushing against my hair. "Thank you for everything," he'd murmured, his voice thick with what I'd mistaken for emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you." I smiled back, warmth flooding my chest. I had been right to believe, I'd thought. All those whispers of doubt, all those worried looks from friends. They had been wrong. We were going to be okay. He told me so. But now, as I stared at the stack of papers on the counter, his signature clean and deliberate, I knew those words had been nothing but smoke and mirrors. I hadn't just given him my love. I'd given him my dreams, my ambitions, my very sense of self. And now, it seemed, he'd taken it all without a second thought. The memory of him kissing my forehead lingered, a ghostly echo of what I once thought was love. But I saw it clearly now. I had been building a life with someone who was already planning his exit. I clutched the edge of the counter, my knuckles whitening, my breath coming out in sharp bursts. The light that had once filled our kitchen now felt harsh, glaring. It illuminated everything I had missed, everything I had chosen not to see. It was all a lie. And suddenly, I felt the first flicker of something new: anger. The courtroom was colder than I imagined it would be. The walls were painted a sterile beige, the kind that drained the life from the room. My hands were clammy, fingers twisted together in my lap as I tried to keep them from shaking. His lawyer, sharp-suited and sharp-tongued, stood tall, flipping through papers with the kind of confidence that came from winning too many times. I watched as she made her opening statements, her voice smooth and unyielding. She spoke of my erratic behavior, of my emotional instability. Words like liability and reckless spender spilled from her lips like venom, each one finding its mark. I felt the walls close in, my breath coming in shallow gasps as she presented. Evidence I had never seen before. Bank statements marked with transactions I didn't recognize, vacations I had never taken, jewelry I'd never owned. I blinked hard, trying to understand. The room blurred around the edges, voices muffling under the weight of my disbelief. And then she handed me the stack of printed emails. My hands trembled as I flipped through them, the familiar letterhead of our shared accounts mocking me. Emails from me, requesting transfers, signing off on loans I never knew existed. My head snapped up, eyes locking with his across the room. He sat there, perfectly composed, not a bead of sweat on his brow. I wanted him to look at me, to flinch, to offer even the smallest crack in his facade, but he didn't. His hands were folded neatly in his lap, his gaze steady, unmoved. "Mrs. Miller," the lawyer's voice pierced through my haze. I looked up, startled. "Can you explain why your signatures are on these documents if you're claiming you had no knowledge of them?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. I felt the room tilt, the weight of 1,000 lies pressing against my chest. "I didn't sign these," I finally managed, my voice small and cracked. Her smile was almost pitying. "The signatures match your own. We had them analyzed. Perhaps you're simply not recalling?" A wave of murmurs washed through the room, and I felt my face burn. I looked back at him, at the man I had loved, supported, sacrificed for. His eyes were fixed on me now, but they were cold, impassive, like I was a stranger begging for mercy. I swallowed hard, tears threatening to spill. "Your Honor," his lawyer continued, "it's clear that Mrs. Miller's reckless spending habits and emotional volatility have caused a significant financial strain on Mr. Miller's business ventures. It's unfortunate, but it's necessary to sever these ties for the sake of the company's future." I didn't even recognize the name they used for me, Mrs. Miller. It sounded hollow now, like a title I'd borrowed but never truly owned. I wanted to scream, to stand up and shout that it was all a lie. But my body betrayed me. I sat there, paralyzed by disbelief, by grief, by the dawning realization that he had planned this, step by step, long before I ever knew what was coming. The judge's gavel hit the wood with a hollow thud. My heart followed suit, splintering in time with the sound. The hearing was over, just like that. Swift, brutal, final. When the room cleared, I stood, my legs wobbling beneath me. I caught his eye as he walked past, flanked by his lawyer and another woman I only vaguely recognized, someone from his company. I blinked, and 1,000 memories rushed back. Her laugh at the company Christmas party, the way she'd always been just a little too familiar, the lingering glances I had brushed off as professional camaraderie. It wasn't just business. It never was. "Wait," I called out, my voice cracking. He paused, turning slightly. The woman beside him whispered something I couldn't hear, but he waved her off, stepping toward me with an air of forced civility. "What do you want, Julia?" he asked, his voice low, almost tender. The sound of it made my stomach twist. I stepped closer, searching his face for anything real, any flicker of regret or guilt. "Why?" I whispered. "Why would you do this to me? After everything? I sacrificed everything for you." He blinked, his eyes darkening just slightly before his mask slipped back into place. "Because you let me," he said simply. His words were blades, cutting cleanly through what little remained of my heart. "You should have paid more attention." I stumbled back, his words knocking the breath from my lungs. He turned away, walking back to her, his hand resting on her lower back with an ease that shattered what was left of me. I watched them go, disappearing, into the marble hallway, their footsteps echoing like nails on a coffin. My own steps were heavier, slower. Outside, the sky had turned gray, thick clouds blotting out the sunlight. I walked for what felt like hours, my feet moving on autopilot, until I reached the door of my new apartment, if you could call it that. It was a studio with peeling paint, a leaking roof, and windows that rattled with every gust of wind. I stepped inside, the silence wrapping around me like a shroud. My fingers fumbled with the lock, and I collapsed. Against the door, sliding down until I was sitting on the cold wooden floor. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there, my knees pulled to my chest, the world spinning in tight, suffocating circles. The photograph sat on the edge of the cracked coffee table, still in its silver frame. Our wedding day. He was looking at me, not at the camera, his eyes bright with promise and lies. I reached for it with trembling hands, clutching it to my chest, feeling the edges bite into my skin, and then I screamed. I screamed until my throat was raw, until my hands hurt from clutching the frame too tightly. I screamed until there was nothing left, until my breath came in ragged gasps, until I lay there, curled up on the floor, the photograph still pressed against my chest. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, feeling the cold seeping through the floorboards and into my bones. This was it. This was where he had left me. Alone. Penniless. Broken. But in that darkness, a whisper stirred in the back of my mind. Faint. Fragile. But unyielding. "Not like this," I whispered, my voice cracking but resolute. I sat up, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. "Not like this," I repeated, the words gaining strength as I said them. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than despair. It was small, barely a flicker, but it was there. Resolve. I wasn't done. Not yet. The motel room was small, barely big enough to fit the sagging bed and the rickety dresser that leaned awkwardly against the wall. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners, revealing patches of cracked plaster underneath. It smelled faintly of mildew and stale cigarettes, scents that seemed to cling to my skin no matter how many times I showered. But it was mine. For now, anyway. The single window was painted shut, and its view was nothing more than the brick wall of the adjacent building. I would sit there sometimes, staring at the rough, uneven surface, tracing the cracks with my eyes like I was mapping. A prison I didn't have the key for. The first days blurred together. Long stretches of silence interrupted only by the occasional rumble of a passing truck or the creaking footsteps of the tenant above me. I slept fitfully, waking up drenched in sweat from dreams I couldn't remember. I avoided mirrors, even the tiny one above the rust-stained sink. I didn't want to see what was left of me. When my money ran thin, I took a job at the diner down the road. It was a greasy spoon kind of place, the kind that smelled like burnt coffee and fried eggs at any hour of the day. I wore an apron 2 sizes too big, and a name tag that read, Julia, even though the letters had faded to a dull gray. The work was brutal in its simplicity. Serving coffee, wiping down tables, balancing trays of pancakes and scrambled eggs. My feet ached at the end of each shift, blisters blooming like flowers along my heels. But there was something about the routine, the mindlessness of it, that gave me comfort. I didn't have to think. I didn't have to remember. I just had to keep moving. I kept my head down, avoiding eye contact, avoiding the conversations that flitted around me like flies. I became good at fading into the background, a shadow slipping through the motions. My hands were always busy, pouring, coffee, scrubbing countertops, stacking dishes. Movement kept me sane. I spent my nights at the library, its dusty warmth a strange kind of refuge. I would sit for hours, my hands buried in legal textbooks, reading pages I barely understood but couldn't seem to stop turning. Words like fraud, embezzlement, and malice began to make sense to me, their weight settling heavy in my bones. Some nights, I would find myself tracing my name on the inside covers of those books, as if writing it down might make it matter again. Julia Miller. My fingers would linger on the ink, pressing down until the letters left faint impressions on the paper. Proof that I still existed. It was during one of those late shifts at the diner that I met Helen. She was a regular, sharp eyes and a voice like gravel, her silver hair tied back in a neat bun. She always sat at the counter, a newspaper folded. In front of her, her black coffee untouched until it went cold. "Mind topping this off?" she'd ask, sliding her cup toward me. Her voice was low and rough, like she'd spent her whole life fighting the world and still hadn't quite won. At first, I kept my answers clipped, polite. But Helen had a way of cracking you open without trying. She would talk about the weather, then her late husband, then her years working in the factory just outside town. I found myself lingering near her seat longer than I needed to, listening as she told stories of survival, of hard winters, empty cupboards, and broken hearts that never quite mended but found ways to beat anyway. "People don't know what they're capable of until they have to be," she'd say, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "And honey, you've got that look about you." "What look?" I'd asked one night, my hands pausing on the edge of the counter. The look of someone who's been broken but didn't shatter. Her eyes met mine, unflinching. "There's a difference, you know." I swallowed hard, nodding even though I didn't fully understand. But I wanted to. God, I wanted to. Helen became my anchor. Her story's a lifeline that I clung to when the nights grew too long and the memories too sharp. She taught me to run in the mornings. "Pound out the pain," she called it. At first my legs screamed in protest, my lungs burning from disuse, but I kept at it. Each morning, I would pull on my scuffed sneakers and hit the pavement, my feet slapping the concrete in steady, rhythmic defiance. Mile after mile, I ran. I ran until my thoughts quieted, until the sound of my breath drowned out everything else. Stopped shaking at the sound of his name. I stopped flinching when I saw his face in my dreams. I stopped crying when I looked at myself in the mirror. One evening, while cleaning out the few belongings I had, I found it. The wedding ring. It was at the bottom of a box I had barely unpacked, wrapped in tissue paper like something precious. I unwrapped it slowly, the metal cool and smooth against my fingers. It glittered in the dying light, casting tiny flecks of gold against the walls. I stared at it for a long time, memories crashing over me like waves. I remembered the way he had slipped it onto my finger, the way he had kissed my knuckles and whispered promises I had believed with every piece of my soul. The ring was heavy in my hand, a symbol of everything I had lost and everything I had survived. My fingers closed around it, and I slipped it into my pocket, the metal pressing into my thigh with every step I took. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it yet, but I knew one thing. I would make it mean something different now. For the first time in months, I felt the flicker of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there, pulsing just beneath my skin. I held onto it, tucked it away where I kept my secrets, and let it burn quietly. I wasn't done. Not yet. The diner was unusually quiet that afternoon, the rain tapping softly against the fogged-up windows like 1,000 tiny drumbeats. I stood behind the counter, wiping down coffee cups and watching the drops trail down the glass in crooked lines. The bell above the door chimed, and I looked up to see a familiar face step inside, shaking off the rain from his coat. At first, I couldn't place him. Just another middle-aged man with gray streaks in his hair and lines etched deep around his eyes. But then he smiled, that lopsided grin pulling at the corner of his mouth. And I remembered. Charles Grayson, the accountant, who used to work with my husband. He used to show up at those ridiculous holiday parties we threw, the ones where I played hostess and he played the part of the quiet observer in the corner, nursing his whiskey and nodding politely. I was wiping down the counter when he approached, his footsteps soft, like he was stepping on glass. "Julia?" His voice was hesitant, as if he wasn't sure it was really me. I forced a smile. "Charles, it's been a long time." He glanced around, his brow furrowing as he took in the chipped linoleum floors, the cracked vinyl seats. "Didn't expect to find you here," he said quietly. His eyes held something that looked like pity, and I hated it. "Me neither," I replied, setting down the cup with a little more force than necessary. "Can I get you something?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Just a black coffee." I poured it for him, the silence stretching long and thin between us. When I slid the cup over, he caught my wrist gently, his grip firm but not unkind. "Can we talk?" I raised an eyebrow. "I'm working." "I'll wait," he said, settling into a booth by the window. I watched him from behind the counter, my hands moving mechanically through the motions of work. My mind buzzed with questions, with suspicion. Charles had always been quiet, almost invisible at those parties, but I remembered how he watched, always watching. My shift ended 2 hours later, and true to his word, Charles was still there, his cup empty, and his hands folded neatly on the table. I slipped out of my apron, grabbed my coat, and slid into the booth across from him. Rain still streaked down the windows, blurring the world outside into patches of gray. "What do you want, Charles?" I asked, folding my arms across my chest. He looked at me, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't quite place. "I shouldn't be here," he murmured, almost to himself. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But I think you deserve to know the truth," my breath caught, in my throat. "What truth?" He glanced around, his fingers drumming nervously against the tabletop. "About the company," he said. "About him." My heart hammered painfully in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Go on." Charles took a deep breath. "He's been lying, Julia. The company. It's not what it seems. He's drowning in debt. Has been for years. Shell accounts, fake investments. He's been bleeding money left and right, hiding it under layers of paperwork. He paused, his eyes locking with mine. The divorce? It wasn't about you. It was about protecting his assets. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, my mind scrambling to process them. No, I whispered, shaking my head. No, that's not possible. He's successful. He always said... Of course he did, Charles cut in, his voice softening. He had to keep up appearances, but I was there, Julia. I saw the numbers. I saw how bad it got. He leaned back, his expression grim. The divorce was part of the plan. He wanted everything in his name away from you, so when the collapse came, you'd be left with nothing. Clean break, no liabilities. I stared at him, the room tilting slightly as his words sank in. My hands gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white. Why are you telling me this? Charles smiled, but it was a sad, bitter thing. Because I left, he replied. I couldn't do it anymore. He's been burning bridges left and right, and I wasn't about to let him burn. Me too. My eyes narrowed. What do you want from me? Nothing, he said, standing up and slipping a business card onto the table. But if you want to know more, call me. I kept records. Some things even he doesn't know I have. He paused, his eyes flicking to the rain-soaked window. Be careful, Julia. Men like him don't leave clean footprints. And then he was gone, the bell above the door chiming as he disappeared into the storm. I sat there for a long time, staring at the card, my fingers tracing the embossed letters. It felt heavy in my hand, like it carried the weight of everything I'd lost and everything I still had to gain. That night, I called him. He answered on the first ring. Meet me tomorrow, he said. The library, noon. I hardly slept. My mind ran wild with possibilities, with the sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't powerless after all. The next morning, I met him at the back of the library, where the shelves smelled of dust and forgotten things. He handed me a manila folder, thick with papers. These are just the beginning, he said, his voice low. If you want the rest, you're going to have to work for it. I took it from him, my fingers brushing the edges, feeling the weight of secrets bound in. Paper and ink. I'll work, I whispered, my voice steady for the first time in months. He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen on his face. I figured you would. The days that followed blurred into a flurry of research. I pored over financial statements, combed through public records, cross-referenced investments with addresses that didn't exist. The more I dug, the more I found. Hidden shell companies, offshore accounts, names I recognized from dinner parties and corporate events. I ran my fingers along the lines of numbers, the zeros that danced across the pages like ghosts of his ambition. I saw through it all, the way he had built an empire on whispers and paper, propped up by illusion and deception. I wasn't the woman on the floor anymore, clutching a photograph and whispering prayers to a ceiling that never answered. I was stronger now, smarter. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I was learning to breathe underwater. And with each piece of evidence I gathered, I felt it building inside me. The storm, the power, the righteous fury of knowing. I finally held something he couldn't take away. It was only a matter of time now. The courthouse loomed above me, its stone walls stretching high into the gray morning sky. The steps felt endless as I climbed them, each one bringing me closer to the confrontation I had been building toward for months. My heart pounded beneath my coat, steady and unyielding. I tightened my grip on the manila folder tucked beneath. My arm, its edges soft from use, the papers inside meticulously organized, every page a weapon forged from the ashes of my old life. Helen had met me for coffee the night before. She slid a hand over mine, squeezing just once before pulling away. "You've got this," she'd said, her eyes shining with something like pride. "He's not ready for you." I replayed her words as I pushed through the heavy wooden doors, my heels clicking against the marble floor with a confidence I hadn't felt in years. People shuffled past, their voices echoing off the high ceilings. But I moved through them, like I was carved from iron, unyielding and unbreakable. He was already there, seated at the defense table, flanked by his new business partner and the same lawyer who had shredded me to pieces not long ago. His suit was sharp, tailored perfectly to his frame, but there were shadows under his eyes now, evidence of sleepless nights and mounting pressure. I paused in the doorway, watching him for a moment. He was staring down at his papers, flipping through them with a practiced nonchalance. But I saw the way his hands shook, just slightly, the way his jaw clenched when he thought no one was looking. When he finally looked up and saw me standing there, his eyes went wide, just for a heartbeat. He masked it quickly, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I walked past him, saying nothing, feeling his gaze burn into my back as I took my seat across the aisle. The courtroom filled quickly, attorneys, clerks, the judge taking his place at the bench. My fingers brushed over the papers in front of me, feeling the weight of every secret I had uncovered, every lie he had woven into the fabric of our life. I had spent months learning the language of finance, of corporate law, of shell companies, and offshore accounts. Helen had connected me with friends, people who knew how to read between the lines, how to unravel the threads of deception until there was nowhere left to hide. I had been thorough. His lawyer stood first, straightening her jacket and offering the judge a polite nod. "Your Honor," she began, her voice smooth as polished glass. "We are here today to finalize the division of assets and address the financial concerns raised by Mr. Miller's company." Her words dripped with confidence, her posture rigid and sure. I almost smiled, almost. When it was my turn, I rose from my chair, smoothing the lines of my coat and stepping forward. My heels clicked with each step, the sound punctuating the silence like gunfire. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady and clear. "I would like to submit new evidence for consideration." A murmur rippled through the room. His lawyer stiffened, her eyes narrowing. "What evidence?" she demanded, her tone brittle. I turned to her, meeting her gaze without flinching. "The truth," I replied simply. The judge motioned for me to continue, and I stepped forward, handing the manila folder to the clerk. Inside are financial records, investment portfolios, and signed statements from former employees, I said, my voice ringing out through the silence. They detail a series of shell companies used to funnel money out of Mr. Miller's primary business. They also include evidence of fraudulent tax filings and hidden offshore accounts. I heard his lawyer hiss something under her breath, but I didn't look at her. My eyes stayed locked on his. His face had gone pale, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the table. He shook his head slightly as if in disbelief, but I saw the cracks spidering through his expression. He was coming apart at the seams. The judge flipped through the papers, his brow furrowing. "Ms. Miller," he said, his voice heavy with authority. "These are substantial allegations. Do you have corroborating testimony?" I straightened my shoulders. "Yes, Your Honor. Several former employees have provided sworn statements regarding the movement of funds. They are prepared to testify if needed." The room fell silent. His business partner, the woman I once saw him with outside the courthouse, leaned in to whisper something frantic in his ear. He brushed her off, his eyes never leaving mine. I saw it then. The fear, the desperation. For the first time, he couldn't charm his way out, couldn't talk circles around the truth. I let it sink in, let him feel it. The rest of the proceedings unfolded in slow, brutal increments. His lawyer floundered, her questions sharp but aimless, like knives thrown in the dark. My responses were clean, deliberate. I had spent months preparing for this moment, and I knew every answer before she even asked the question. I saw him crumble, in real time, his hands shaking, his eyes flickering with something desperate and dark. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was like the crack of thunder. All assets will be frozen pending investigation. Ms. Miller is to be awarded reparations for damages and losses incurred. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. It was over. I stood, gathering my papers, my hands steady, my breath slow and deliberate. I could feel his eyes on me, burning with rage, disbelief, and something deeper, fear. I walked toward the door, my heels striking the marble with steady confidence. When I reached him, I paused, just for a moment. He looked up at me, his face drawn and pale. His business partner was nowhere to be seen. I leaned in, my voice barely above a whisper. "I hope you understand," I said, echoing his own words from that first day when he left me broken on our kitchen floor. His eyes flinched, just slightly, and I knew I'd hit the mark. I didn't wait for him to respond. I walked out of the courthouse, the sunlight blinding as I stepped onto the street. It was warm, spilling over my shoulders, lighting up the world in shades of gold and fire. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the smell of rain-soaked pavement and blooming flowers. My hand, I still held it, the wedding ring, the one I had found at the bottom of my box of things, the one I couldn't seem to throw away. I turned it over in my palm, watching the way it glimmered in the light. For a moment, I almost slipped it back into my pocket, but I didn't. Instead, I walked to the fountain at the entrance, its water sparkling under the sunlight. I stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of it in my hand. Then, with a steady breath, I dropped it into the water. It sank slowly, glimmering all the way down until it vanished into the depths. Gone, but never forgotten. I turned away, the weight of it gone from my hand, and for the first time in years, I felt light, free. I walked down the steps, my heels clicking, in time with my heartbeat, steady and sure. I had rebuilt myself from ashes, from betrayal, from heartbreak, and I had won. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living.